Consider this before viewing the Revolutionary War, an army of amateurs. The Continental Congress funded its new army without having the power to tax the colonies. As you watch the documentary, pay attention to the role that private funding played. Dollars, and how did Congress back the new currency? Assignment Discovery now presents the Revolutionary War, an army of amateurs.
The country into which I had just set my foot was set on fire about my ears. The fatal 19th of April, the moment the event of that day was known, I rejected the sullen-tempered Pharaoh of England forever. Thomas Paine.
After the clash at Lexington on April 19th, express riders rushed from one New England village to another, shouting the news that the King's troops had spilled colonial blood. Within a day, 20,000 men responded.
The militiamen are now simply ordinary people with a hat's trunk, you might say, and with a rifle or with a musket. How good soldiers are they? Well, they've drilled. They've had perhaps some target practice. They are amateur soldiers.
Their counterparts, the redcoats, once had been weavers or shoemakers or farmers themselves. But each had failed and found himself forced into the job of last resort, British soldier. A popular English saying warned, "A messmate before a shipmate before a stranger before a dog, and a dog before a soldier."
The redcoats, whether or not they were the dregs of British society, and many of them came from the very poorest of the poor, it's true, were full-time soldiers, taught how to kill and how to bayonet, and taught also discipline, so that they were, in a sense, trained to act like automatons and to go onto the field of battle and do what they were told. With a combination of and of terror and of threats if they deserted, these people once caught, in a sense, became what you might call His Majesty's slaves. And these were the very same people who, under better circumstances, would simply have emigrated to America.
Only a generation before, redcoats and colonists had fought together in the French and Indian War. Together, they drove the French from America, but at a crippling cost to the British. England was in debt, and for the first time, American colonists were expected to help Britain's bills.
This is a nation that has been racked by a 7-year international war for empire with France and Spain. They've emerged the winners. They have an enormous war debt. They have to keep the Navy mobilized because is far from defeated. They're desperate for money. The English people have been taxed until they can be taxed no more.
The English people themselves had no quarrel with the Americans because they, as it were, flesh of the flesh and blood of the Americans. They were the same people who on one side of the ocean were doing the work in England on the farms, on the other side of the ocean was settling America.
An old New England militia captain explained in simple terms what finally pushed farmers and merchants and woodsmen into defying the greatest power on earth. What we meant in going for those redcoats, he said, was this. We had always governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean we should. When news of the bloodshed reached a 34-year-old militia captain named Benton, He closed his Connecticut and headed to the rebel camp at Cambridge. Outside Boston, Arnold found the newborn American army laying siege with no siege weapons. He knew that on Lake Champlain, on the New York frontier, the British had more than 100 cannons at a fortress called Ticonderoga. Arnold set off to recruit men to attack it. He soon learned that others were already on their way, the brawling woodsmen who called themselves the Green Mountain Boys, led by a swilling giant of a man named Ethan Allen. Allen and Arnold agreed to attack Ticonderoga together. At dawn on May 10th, 83 Americans crept toward the fort. They found the gate open. Only one sentry was on duty, and he was asleep. He awoke, his musket wouldn't fire, and away. Outside the officers' quarters, Ethan Allen yelled, "Come out, you old rat!" In 10 minutes, without a shot fired, Allen demanded surrender of the greatest fortress in America, from a half-dressed British officer still holding his trousers.
The British, I think, are humiliated by the loss of Ticonderoga. They had taken this great fortress from the French at enormous cost in the 7 Years' War. And here, in 1775, was what one British officer called ragamuffin, seizing this strategic post from its British garrison. It did come as a considerable blow to British pride.
8 days after the capture of Ticonderoga, news reached the rebel leaders in Philadelphia. But the Continental Congress was more alarmed than elated by this overt act of aggression. It immediately ordered all the guns inventoried for return to the British as soon as hostilities had cooled down. Despite the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, the men in Concord, like most colonists, hesitated to go to war against England. They still hoped for reconciliation.
Our situation here is beyond description almost. We are every hour expecting an attack by land or water. Fire and slaughter are hourly threatened. Boston loyalist Peter Oliver.
2 days after Lexington, 20,000 rebels surrounded Boston. Tragedy with the Redcoats were thousands of Americans still loyal to the King of England. The British Commander-in-Chief, General Gage, asked London for 20,000 troops to suppress the insurrection. London granted 2,000, and 3 generals, Henry Clinton, Howe, and John. The rebel press noted that the ship carrying the generals to the colonies was called the Cerberus, after the mythical three-headed dog guarded the gates of hell. The British generals planned to attack the Americans and break the deadlock at Boston. But within 24 hours, rebel spies reported the British strategy to the Americans. The Americans decided to move first and occupy the Charlestown Peninsula. Their plan was to build fortifications above Boston Harbor, the lifeline for British supplies. The place they chose was called Bunker Hill. They chose to lead them was Massachusetts Colonel William Prescott. On the evening of June 16th, Prescott and more than 1,000 men moved out to fortify Bunker Hill. Instead, in the confusion of the rebels chose a lower site called Breed's Hill. The Americans labored all night on their defenses. At first light, a watchman aboard a British warship was shocked to discover that the face of Breed's Hill was crowned by a 136-foot-long. General Clinton proposed landing 2 forces on the Charlestown Peninsula and trapping the Americans between them. Surprisingly, General Gage overruled him and prepared for a more perilous move, a frontal assault.
The decision of the British to actually storm the American defences on Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill as it was, may seem now rather odd, but the reason they was primarily psychological. The British had suffered an embarrassing, humiliating reverse on the day of Lexington and Concord. So to reassert the superior regular troops over the colonial militia.
Gage's strategy required waiting 6 hours for high tide, more hours for the Americans to Breed's Hill. In Boston, General Gage stared through a spyglass at the hill and asked the identity of the tall man the earthworks, braving the cannonade from British warships. The aide said it was his own brother-in-law, William Prescott. When Gage asked, "Will he fight?" the aide replied, "I cannot answer for his men, but Prescott will fight you to the gates of hell." At the rebel redoubt, an elegantly dressed patriot arrived, carrying a borrowed musket on his arm, a book of poetry in his pocket. Joseph Warren was one of the colony's most successful physicians and the leader of the Boston rebels. At dinner the evening before, he had confided to companions that he had foreseen his death on this hill, but he had no intention of ducking the fray.
These fellows say we won't. I hope I shall die up to my knees in British blood.
By 2 o'clock, the British had landed 2,500 troops. By 3 o'clock, they were ready. Along with much of Boston, General Burgoyne watched the assault on Breed's Hill. The redcoats collapsed. Officers in particular were singled out.
They have appalling officer casualties. Stuff that scares the dickens British command structure because they have not experienced death rates and serious wound rates among the officer corps like that in a comparable engagement for living memory.
Bringing up reinforcements, Howe ordered a second attack. And then a third. By now, the rebels were nearly out of powder. In the last charge, some had even fired broken glass, rocks, and nails in place of musket balls. Prescott's men waited until the redcoats were again in range, their last precious rounds. Major Pitcairn, who had led the redcoats onto Lexington Green just 2 months earlier, went down with 4 shots in him and died in the arms of his son. Defenseless now against British bayonets, Prescott finally ordered his men to
The dead and wounded lay on every side of us. Their groans were piercing. Our orders were to make the best retreat we could. We set off almost with fatigue, leaving some of our in the field.
Among those left in the field was the Patriot leader who had foreseen his own death, Joseph. He was 34 years old. By day's end, the British had won the field, but at a terrible price. Their casualty rate, over 40%, the highest the British would suffer in the entire revolution. 1,000 men were killed or wounded. General Clinton said it was a dear-bought victory. Another would have ruined us. The Americans lost the hill, but they won a newfound confidence. What they lacked was training, a treasury, and a leader. In May of 1775, American militiamen surrounded Boston. The Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. The 45 delegates were greeted with parades and musket salutes. But to the British, the distinguished members of the rebel Congress were outlaws. Every one of them could be hanged for treason. John, the wealthiest man in New England, personally bankrolled the rebellion. Pennsylvania's most celebrated citizen, Benjamin Franklin, had just returned from rallying support for America's rebels. The radical orator Patrick Henry had been declared an outlaw by the governor of Virginia and could not set foot in his home colony. Finally, there was the always Samuel Adams, the most vocal advocate of independence from the British Empire. Still hoping to restore peace, Congress prepared for war. It proclaimed the jumble of militia companies besieging Boston the American Continental Army. Paying the army was another matter. Congress had no power to levy taxes, so it simply invented a currency and issued 2 million new notes called Continental dollars, signed and engraved by silversmith Spear. Congress also had to choose a man to lead the new army. The commander of the militia, Artemus Ward, had never led troops in battle and was thought too timid. At 57, the veteran Connecticut Colonel Israel Putnam was thought too old. The most experienced officer, a former English colonel named Charles Lee, was just too British. Samuel Adams' influential cousin John wanted a man from the South, someone who could bring the other colonies into New England's war. What they all wanted was a man they could trust with the terrible power of an army. On June 14th, Adams began to glowingly describe his candidate.
A gentleman from Virginia who is among us here, and very well known to all of us. A gentleman with skill and experience as an officer, independent fortune, great talents, and excellent universal character.
Colonel George Washington of Virginia had arrived each day at Congress, conspicuously clad in the red and blue uniform worn in the French and Indian War. At the end of that war, Washington had campaigned for an officer's commission in the British Army. The British turned him down. Now, Washington was campaigning once again.
George Washington was a very unlikely choice. There weren't a lot of other choices. the Americans didn't have a very strong military tradition separate from the British. It was a society that was a part of the British Empire. I think George Washington maybe wasn't the greatest military figure in the world or the greatest man for the job at the time, but I think the greatness of the man was his ability to sort of himself as the best man for the job at a time when somebody to do that. They were all brand new to the game. They didn't know where they were going. He had the great moxie, to show up at the Continental Congress and be his own PR. He said, I'm here, I can.
Voted unanimously to name Washington Commander-in-Chief. The 43-year-old Virginian had commanded troops in only 2 battles. One of them started the French and Indian War. The other, he lost.
Looking back at it a couple centuries later, it was a great choice. But at the time, I mean, it was a crapshoot.
When Washington left Philadelphia to join the army, he wrote a soldier's farewell to his wife, Martha.
I go fully trusting in that providence which has been more bountiful to me than I deserve. I retain unalterable affection for you, which neither time nor distance can change.
He assured her he'd return by Christmas, and he would, years later. Washington would be facing the finest army in the world. The British regulars had served in 10 years, while the American militia was mostly untrained. But a New York newspaper noted a rebel advantage. Be considered that there is a very material difference between a man who fights for his natural liberty and the man who only fights because he is paid. The British did possess 1,000 times the wealth of the colonists, who could barely manufacture weapons or gunpowder. The American Navy consisted of 8 small vessels against 270 British warship. The world would be watching to see if the insolent Yankees could vanquish the professional Redcoats. To see if the American David could against the British Goliath.
Likewise, I'll sell my spinning wheel to buy my love a sword of steel. Johnny has gone for a soldier.
Revolutionary War. If amateurs talk about this. At the end of the Battle of Bunker Hill, the rebels had to fire glass, rocks, or nails from their muskets because they had depleted their ammunition. Speculate on how the outcome of Bunker Hill would have been different if the colonial soldiers had more munition. Now try this. Look for examples of editorial cartoons from the 1700s and discuss how they succeed or don't succeed in conveying their points. Then draw your own 18th century style political cartoon to share with a class. To learn more, Assignment Discovery, Rules of Civility by George Washington. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support the Revolutionary War, an army of amateurs.